Hi, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Our September 2008 TV program examined some of the flaws in the government's official story about what had happened 7 years before on September 11, 2001. A growing number of people, including many scientists, architects, engineers, pilots, and other professionals, have continued to analyze new information. So now we are presenting some of that new information on this new program, along with some of the persistent critiques of the government's official story. On the very next day after the September 11 attacks, Dick Cheney said that we should respond by attacking Iraq. The next month, Bush launched a war against Afghanistan, and Congress passed the Patriot Act without even reading it. Everything was happening at once, and people were feeling just overwhelmed by the rush of events. But some people started to challenge the official story and ask questions that the mainstream media were not asking and that the government really was not wanting to answer. People were asking thoughtful questions, but they were not getting credible answers. The official culture wants to dismiss these kinds of questions as conspiracy theorists, but the vast majority of the skeptics are thoughtful, intelligent, meticulous, and well-respected citizens, and they keep finding that the government story has holes in it. They find evidence that rebuts the government's official story, and they've discovered what seem to be deliberate efforts to prevent the alternative information from coming out. We believe that it is okay to ask hard questions. We believe it's okay to question the official story, to hold up actual evidence, compare it with the official story, and to stay open-minded and follow the truth wherever it goes. So this program will follow up on the program from 2 years before. We have two guests who were present on the previous program, Terry Machinata and Drew Gibbs. These are local folks who have spent hundreds of hours researching the topic. They approach the topic with open minds and with practical attitudes, and I'm happy to welcome Terry and Drew.
Thanks.
I'm glad you're back to explore the topic further.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
We'll have a good time and pack a lot of information in like we did on the previous program. Our previous program had addressed a great many aspects of the 9/11 situation, and this current program will not deal with the airplanes that hit the Pentagon or Pennsylvania, but will focus especially on the World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7, and on the government's investigation and reports. We'll also focus on the need to be open-minded and mature in how we address the programs. Researchers have brought forth new information since our 2008 program, especially regarding evidence of explosives in those buildings. And so we'll address that during the hour. And we'll discuss why it's so hard for people to grapple with these kinds of hard questions. None of us are true believers in any kind of a conspiracy theory, not the one that's promoted by the government and not the one that some people have put out that are less well grounded in facts. But we do believe in examining all the information with open mind and letting the chips fall where they may. And we encourage you, the viewers, to do your own research. There are plenty of sources of information, and we'll list those by the end of the program. Terry, I know this has been a special concern of yours. Can you share your sense of that, the open-mindedness and the difficulty of grappling with these kinds of hard issues?
Yes, Glenn, one of the things that became obvious to me as I was investigating this is how important it is for us to be able to move from that place of being, trying to vilify people who disagree with us, to being at a place where we realize that, as you indicated, that people with good minds and really a positive intention are really attempting to find out what the facts are. And we're faced with a lot of issues at this time with our economy and wars and everything else. And it can make a person feel a little bit helpless, or maybe a lot helpless and even overwhelmed. And during this program, I'm hopeful that in our discussion, we'll be able to move from that place of really wondering if it's even worth investigating to, yes, it is worth investigating, and it's our patriotic duty to do so. And as we do that, we will gain a spirit of cooperation and understanding and tolerance for each other that this country desperately needs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know you share the same sense. We've talked about this a number of times in the last few months when we were deciding we should do another program on the topic.
That's right. It's still important to look at this stuff even 9 years later because 9/11 is used as kind of the emotional underpinning that supports this continual wars of aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan and the ongoing war on terror. And so we need to look at 9/11 continually.
And part of that sense of open-mindedness and let the chips fall where they may, includes admitting when we made a mistake. And I made a mistake on the previous program we did, so I want to correct that information right at the outset. There was a passport from one of the hijackers that crashed into the buildings that was recovered afterward. And on the program, my recollection was that I had heard a news report saying that it was directly below the building, and then a close friend whom I respect said, actually that was some blocks away. So I just want to correct that I had misstated where that passport was found. I'm still troubled by the idea that if this guy was a passenger in a plane and the passport is something you carry on your person in a pocket, because you have to have that when you go through customs when you land before you get your luggage, so it would have been on his person. If he was in the airplane that crashed in the building and blew up and burned, how did it end up
Seems unlikely.
In good condition?
Right.
So that problem still exists,
Yeah,
but it was
point.
found blocks away, not directly underneath. So I apologize for that misstatement. Now, World Trade Center's Building 1 and 2 were struck by two different airplanes. Each tower burned for just a relatively brief time before it collapsed at a speed that was close to a free fall gravity rate of speed. And the official story blames columns, the big heavy steel columns, with burning and collapsing and causing this. What does the evidence say about this? Either of you?
Well, I'll start with saying that my understanding is the official story indicated that they weakened, but they did not melt. And there's a disagreement about there being molten steel in the structure. But I'll save some of that for a little bit later. But go ahead, Drew.
Well, one thing to mention is that there's two things to mention that are coming to mind at the moment. But they quickly scrubbed the site of like 98.9 or 99 point. Almost all of the debris and steel was trucked off immediately. From the samples that they did, or what they did save, They did save some samples of steel from the apparently that were supposedly around the impact zones where the planes impacted the buildings. And I think something like less than 2% of those samples that they saved, they did perform tests on those, and they saw less than 2% saw temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. So to me and to scientists, that indicates that the temperatures were nowhere near hot enough to have this kind of stated reason for the column failure theory of the collapse.
Right, and the smoke that we saw did not look like, the flames that we saw and the smoke did not indicate a hot fire either, because a really hot fire is like blue or, but this looked like just a regular kind of fire, and then the black smoke is a fire, indicates a fire that's not getting much oxygen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's not a hot fire.
There's also, I think that you mentioned this last time, Drew, is that when NIST came out with its final report,
and that's
it actually...
That's a federal agency that did a study of this. We'll talk about them later. But,
yeah, that they... apparently there was a disagreement among the people who were actually there during the experiment, and that they found that there was not sufficient heat to be able to create that problem. And in the official story, they'd indicated there was a 42-inch slumping of the structure, but in fact there was only a few inches. Maybe you can go into a little more detail.
But that was based on a computer model, wasn't it?
No, those were the actual physical tests that NIST contracted, I believe, Underwriters Laboratories to conduct, to test. And exactly right. In the computer model, they had to make it sag up to 42 inches. I think you're right, to make their computer simulation work. But in the physical tests, actually only showed the sagging of maybe a few inches.
Yeah, 3 or 4 inches, something like that.
Okay. Another thing that occurs to me is that steel conducts heat really well.
Exactly.
And so it had so many columns. It had, 47 core columns that carried weight, and then it had all kinds of other horizontal trusses and all kinds of things. So the heat would have dissipated throughout the area.
Wicked away the heat and conducted the heat.
And I think you can probably talk about one of the engineers who designed the building. He talked about it later, and he said that it was actually over-designed by a factor of 10. And
yeah, I don't know the factor on there, but yeah, absolutely.
They had designed it to withstand an impact from a 707 full of gasoline. Or jet fuel.
Yeah, exactly.
Kerosene.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so they had factored that in and designed it accordingly.
And some people said that, I think that some engineers indicated that actually more than one aircraft could have hit and then still would have stood. So that doesn't really, the official story just doesn't make sense in that regard.
Okay. Now, these are the Twin Towers that everybody remembers because we've seen those images on TV a lot. There is another building that was not hit by an airplane, and it collapsed also. And I wonder if one of you can tell about Building 7, just briefly to get it going, and we'll come back and talk some more about that in a few minutes.
Terry, you want to talk about
that? Well, one of the things that I came across just recently is a video that indicated that there are a number of anomalies. And clearly, it was a building that was able to fall straight down in its own footprint, and yet they're saying that fire inside the building, and it began at floor 13, created that problem.
And this is out of a 47-story building.
Yeah, exactly.
So the fire was on just a few floors.
Right. Yeah. And firemen had said that the fire was essentially, it was almost completely out. And that happened within an hour or so after the fire started.
Right, and that fire had started from debris and stuff from the two buildings, which are some distance away.
Yeah, there's a building, I think it was building 3.
Another building in between.
Was in between.
And this thing didn't collapse until like 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
5.5 hours later, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that were going on with that, and there were individuals, witnesses, who indicated that they saw and heard things that would indicate to them that there was a countdown going on at that time. So, and that's something that, you see that on video, that a guy is saying that, and he's saying that there was a Red Cross person who had a radio, and they had their hand covering it, and then the last, just 3 seconds before the building fell, the Red Cross man looked up and he said, "Run." And it was like he didn't want this on his conscience for these people to die without getting a warning, so he told them.
Well, the building had been evacuated hours before. There's a lot of evidence of foreknowledge that they knew it was going to collapse.
Well, there were statements from a number of people in the background research I read. A number of people had predicted that, and there actually were news reports where news reporters said that the building has collapsed or will soon collapse or is collapsing or something.
The BBC.
And it was still there. BBC was one.
Yep, and in fact, the reporter was standing in front of the building. Building 7 was still standing, and they were talking about it as if it had already fallen.
Now, and this was the third time in one day that a big steel framed skyscraper had collapsed and from fire, and none had ever done that before in the history or since.
That's right.
And yet 3 did in one day, and that building 7 is the fishiest in my mind because the fire was so minimal.
Yeah,
and it collapsed some hours after the fire was largely out.
Building 5 had more damage to it than did Building 7. Okay, and Building 5 did not collapse. And there have been statements that I've read that indicated that other buildings have collapsed other than 1, 2, and 7. But the truth is that those were only partial collapse. Building 7, 1, and 2 are the only ones in the history of the world that have completely come down, supposedly because of fire. Every other instance where a steel frame building has come completely down, it was because of controlled demolition.
Right. There's some evidence of controlled demolition in the Twin Towers, even without getting into evidence of explosives, but there's a variety of evidence that suggests that the 2 towers came down from a controlled demolitions where the explosives had been placed in there first, and then they were detonated after the airplanes hit. And I wonder, well, you have some information. There's a card here that we can maybe take a look at, and people can see the photo of the building, and then in a moment Terry will read some of the bits of evidence. But when you look at the photo there, it does not look like a fire. It's a lot of gray. It looks like dust.
Well, it
looks like an explosion.
It looks like an explosion.
It's just intense pulverization of concrete that you see there.
Yeah. And so we'll get a view of that on the camera, so people can get a good look at what that looks like. But that's not dust. That's pulverized concrete that people are seeing, because the fire did not produce that kind of.
Nor would the collapse itself produce that kind of pulverization all the way down.
So this is put up by a group of architects and engineers who are studying this, and they have
15 points.
15
points. The case for explosive demolition of the World Trade Center towers.
And this is by architects and engineers.
Exactly. The first is sudden onset of destruction. Second, destruction occurred at near free fall pace. The destruction followed the path of greatest resistance. Number 4, the perimeter column steel was ejected laterally up to 500 feet. 5, blast waves blew out windows in buildings 400 feet away. 6, 118 first responders report explosions at the onset of the destruction. Number 7, numerous eyewitness reports of flowing molten metal in rubble. And experts, by the way, have said that that was steel, molten steel. Number 8, mid-air pulverization of concrete with outward arcing plumes. And some indication that some of that went as far away as New Jersey, by the way. Pretty hard to do with just gravity. Number 8, mid-air, okay. Number 9, rapid expansion and pyroclastic flow of enormous dust cloud. 10, squibs, explosive injections 40 stories below the impact zone. Number 11, total dismemberment of steel core column structures. 12, 1,200 feet diameter symmetrical debris field. 13, chemical evidence of thermate on steel and in dust samples. 14, FEMA steel analysis, sulfidation, oxidation, and intergranular melting. 15, no precedent for steel frame high-rise collapse caused by fire.
Okay, so we'll put that back up there again so people may be able to see the appearance of that. It's just a lot of anomalies.
Well,
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're clear indications of demolition.
Yeah. So tell us what else you might be aware of from this, how the explosives would work.
Okay, well,
what's the best thinking?
One quick note on that picture, and that's an excellent picture to see, but it's also important, if you can, to view video. It's troubling to see the video of the towers collapsing, but you really get a sense of some of these issues, and you can see some of the things a little more clearly.
Yeah,
too.
well, you can see like the squibs, the little, on some photos, you can see the little, look like little explosive
Flashes.
things
Yeah.
all the way down.
Sure, sure.
You'll see on one of the videos, you'll see the antenna collapsing that was on the very top of the building, which is where antennas would be, and that was collapsing before other parts did, so that leads you to believe that the central core was
Right.
Absolutely.
being taken down, which is how they do it in controlled demolitions. You take down the core, and then the sides of the building come in, so it collapses on its own. Whereas in a fire, and here in this case, it was hit by an airplane from the side, and the fire was starting at that side, and you would think that the building would fall over sideways.
Yeah.
But instead it went straight down. In fact, one tower had started to tilt sideways, the top part of it, and then you'll see it corrected itself and then went straight down, as if it was being pulled out from underneath.
And another thing too, Glenn, is if you look at the video, you'll see that the building didn't actually fall down, that it actually disintegrated.
That's right.
And that part you were talking about that fell over, it fell, and then we never saw it again. It didn't appear on the ground. It disappeared in the air. So what force would have done that?
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that it is suspected that radio-controlled demolition was occurring here. So it was computer-controlled. So it could actually be made to look like it had been caused by impact. But with radio control like that, you can make any floor detonate at any time.
Right.
That was technically possible at that time.
Right.
Exactly.
For sure.
Right. So some of the new information since the previous program that we did involves the thermite. Tell us what that is, what the evidence was that people have seen, and how credible are the people who have analyzed this?
Yeah, well, I think very credible. I've been looking at the topic in general for several years now, but there's a kind of a core team of scientists and academics from varying professional and academic backgrounds that have coalesced into a team and have worked on analyzing some of the dust that blanketed Lower Manhattan after the towers collapsed. And I think about 2 or 3 years ago, Stephen Jones was talking a lot about his hypothesis about controlled demolition of the towers, and he was getting some airtime on that. And a woman named Jeanette McKinley saw that, and she noted that he had a request out for some of this dust. He wanted to analyze the dust and see what could be discovered. And so she had an apartment that was very close to ground zero, and her apartment, the windows had been blown out when the towers fell, and her apartment was covered with dust, shovelfuls of dust, inches thick, and she had saved some dust. So when she found out that Stephen Jones was requesting dust, she contacted him and gave him a sample of dust. And the first thing that they noticed were these little iron microspheres all throughout the dust, very tiny, from the size of a BB to smaller. You know, you had a magnet, and these little iron microspheres would come toward the magnet. And so then they also observed these little red-gray chips in the dust, throughout the dust. So, but at that time, they mainly analyzed the little iron microspheres, and they, using scanning electron microscope, you know, could understand the chemical signature, and it was very close to thermite, the chemical signature for thermite. So,
and that's an explosive, a
yeah,
very, very powerful.
Well, thermite is an incendiary. It's an energetic material that when it's ignited, you know, if it's heated or ignited, will undergo a chemical reaction that then is incendiary as opposed to explosive.
Oh, okay.
The explosive comes in just a little bit later down the discussion, but it's very incendiary, means it gets very, very hot and will cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, you know, kind of thing. And so, first of all, the fact that they are discovering little iron microspheres all throughout the dust means that iron was molten at one point. So that
Had to be.
it indicates a very high temperature, much higher temperature. The melting point of iron is 1,535 degrees Celsius. So
2,500 Fahrenheit, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the fires that occurred in the buildings or the collapse of the towers, none of those could have produced any kind of temperatures like that. Do you want me to go on about the red-gray chips now too?
Yeah,
or?
yeah.
Okay.
Let me just interject a little
Yeah.
piece here.
Yeah.
I believe there's videotaping of the collection of samples from 4 different areas, including the George Washington Bridge. And they actually have a great chain of custody for that. So this is evidence. Is just it wasn't just a housewife who with good intentions tried to do this, but they actually had proper chain of custody.
Absolutely.
Custody for that.
Okay.
So I wanted to interject that.
So tell us some more about this evidence.
Yeah. Well, and that was a couple of years ago when they were looking at the iron microspheres.
2007, 2008, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So since then, like Terry's saying, there's been more samples that have been acquired. I think one was from the Brooklyn Bridge, collected maybe 15 minutes after one of the towers fell. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. There's a paper that the results of all this research has been presented in. It's called Active Thermitic Material Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe. And they talk about the provenance of the samples, meaning very extremely low likelihood that there was any contamination of the samples. So these are scientists working on this.
Yeah.
If people are wondering where the credentialed and legit people are looking at this stuff, these are the people, that were, and so you can look at that paper and it's really, really thorough discussing what they did. But that's an important point, the provenance of the samples.
So the point is that they detected things in there that would not have otherwise been in the building. It would not have been in the the carpet. It would not have been in the desks. It would not have been in the light fixtures. It would not have been any place in the building unless it was put there to be this incendiary to stimulate the destruction.
Well, yeah. What this paper describes is how they've conducted the tests on the red-gray chips now and determined that it's an advanced engineered pyrotechnic it might be called nanothermite.
Yeah, which nano is extremely small, like billionth of a
a billion. Yeah, a nanometer is a billionth of a meter.
Yeah, so
approaching the atomic level.
Right. Yeah.
So there's no way that the elements that they discovered composed these chips. They all did occur in building contents, but there's no way they could have milled themselves into this optimized fine powder.
And for any kind of an explosive thing, the finer the powder, the more explosive. I mean,
Absolutely.
I remember when I was a kid, and there'd be like you'd hear of explosions in grain elevators from dust from wheat or something.
Yeah.
And this is something that's designed to be incendiary and
Absolutely.
and very, very fine.
Another thing too, since the last time we've discovered that some of the steel is actually vaporized. So You don't get that by fires at low temperature, only by 3,000 degree Fahrenheit and higher.
Yeah, the nanoscale that they're talking about here is what takes the thermite from the incendiary to explosive. You've got now it's just optimized for.
Yeah, and so and I know there had been retrofitting in the building where they're putting in supposedly fire retardants or other
upgrading the
kinds of
fireproofing.
things.
Yeah,
and so people did have access to the building and if you're the guy who's putting stuff on, you don't know what it is, but it's from whoever the supplier was. And so I've read, without going into the details, I've read a lot of background about people connected with the building and companies connected who had access and had research in those kinds of technologies.
Yeah. I think nanothermite can be contained in a sol gel type of formulation, and could even be applied unknowingly to a worker. I mean,
So somebody's in there painting this on or spraying it on or something, and
you'd never know.
And you wouldn't know any more than you know the chemistry of the paint that you're using or something.
Sure.
So that's been fascinating stuff. Not so much in the mainstream press, but I've seen this in other places, including articles that you've shared with me, and it's around, but it's just not being promoted like the press would say, golly, here's some movie star that's going through a nasty divorce, and all of a sudden that you get news about that, but you don't get news about this. Tell us something about the commission, the federal commission that was created to supposedly study this. The September 11 events were like the biggest catastrophe in the form of a crime, a crime of the century kind of thing. And you'd think that the government would say, golly, we got to find out what's going on. And yet from the very outset, Bush and Cheney said, absolutely not, we don't want any investigation of this. And they just dragged their feet, and they opposed it. And then when the commission to study the 9/11 events was finally formed, they found various ways to obstruct, to refuse to provide documents, to refuse to let administration people testify, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And that was perplexing.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say the least. What else can you tell us about either the formation of the commission or its leadership or how it functioned?
Oh, one thing, there's a great book on this, is the 9/11, was it 9/11 Commission, Omissions and Distortions, by David Ray Griffin. That's an excellent book that I'd recommend to anyone who's serious about wanting to take a look at this. Right from the outset, the commission was set up with the appearance of being impartial, but as a matter of fact, as you go through, you see that they aren't impartial. And one of the biggest drawbacks that I saw as I reviewed it again for the second time is that they didn't look at any alternative theory. It was like they started right out with the idea that this was done by Al-Qaeda and that's it, And when you're doing an investigation as for a crime, you have to look at all the alternatives, and then you come up with the one that the evidence fits the best. That wasn't done in this case.
Absolutely. Yeah. Philip Zelikow, the executive director, was a Bush administration official, and he led much of and guided the commission to look at this and look at that.
And also prevented them from seeing things that he didn't want them to see. I mean, he was the gatekeeper as the executive director, and he had worked for Condoleezza Rice. He was part of the
transition team.
And he worked on this document with Project for a New American Century, which was the neoconservatives, kind of their analysis and platform about how to remake the world from their standpoint. And he was the guy that had come up with the notion that says, for the kinds of things we want to accomplish here, it's going to take a new Pearl Harbor. And he was in charge of the 9/11 Commission.
Yeah,
I mean, he was already in it up to his teeth.
Yeah, well, I didn't realize he was a member of that PNAC crew, but he was the author of the preemptive war paper, you know,
There you go.
that kind of thing. And so,
Maybe that was
Maybe,
it. But he had some connection with that phrase about New Pearl Harbor.
And you talk about an investigation. Can you imagine any investigation where you don't have the eyewitnesses to be present to testify? And that's what happened with the 9/11 Commission. They didn't allow the first responders to give testimony. But fortunately, the fire chief for the city of New York, if I got this right, he actually required the first responders to give their testimony in videotape form. And so we still have some of that. They destroyed a bunch of it, but we still have some of that available. So that counter, that really contradicted information that was presented to the commission.
Okay. Were those the ones who had said that they had heard explosions in the building, including explosions in the basement?
Exactly. They were actually blown off their feet. It was so strong. And that was before the building started to collapse.
Yeah.
So
I think the New York Times had to do some legal maneuvering to get the release of those testimonies.
yeah.
So one other thing to mention about the commission, I think a lot of the information and the bulk of the information on Al Qaeda in chapters 5 through 7 was derived through the interrogations of these prisoners down in Guantanamo and maybe other sites. And so the commission, third and fourth hand, is getting information derived from enhanced interrogation techniques.
Which is we call torture.
We call torture.
They call it enhanced interrogation.
So Philip Zelikow said that's the way it went, and that happened. So, boy, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, there's another odd thing. When you and I were on the phone talking to prepare for the program, you mentioned something that I remembered as a quotation from the Watergate era when Deep Throat said, "Follow the money." You said that actually goes back to H.L. Mencken,
Right.
long before. And you said that the 9/11 Commission said that the financing of the 9/11 events wasn't important and they weren't going to look at that. And there's a lot of suspicious stuff going on about where the money came from.
Yeah.
You had told me about, well, I also read independently about the head of Pakistani's intelligence agency, their equivalent of the CIA and
the
FBI.
ISI.
It was the ISI, and the head of that had wired money to finish the story.
Well, yeah. Okay, so the head of Pakistani ISI at the time, Mahmoud Ahmed, he requested or said to Omar Saeed Sheikh to wire $100,000 to Muhammad Atta in the month before 9/11. And so, but apparently according to the 9/11 Commission, the financing of the attacks is of little practical significance. So they didn't talk about that. But that's documented. The Times of India reported it. The FBI corroborated it, I believe. But so Omar Saeed Sheikh is fairly famous. I think he's...
Oh, yeah, he's notorious.
Notorious.
Yeah.
He went to the London School of Economics. He a standout student apparently, dropped out at a certain point, and became like a financial advisor for Al Qaeda or something. But he also has links to the ISI. So this story where you've got the head of the ISI basically wiring through Omar Saeed Sheikh $100,000 to the lead hijacker is pretty interesting lead that the commission just didn't talk about.
Yeah, again, it's an odd thing. If you're going to have a commission to understand what goes on, and you say we're not going to look at the financial end of it, it's like, why?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well,
why don't they want to find out as much as they could find out?
Absolutely.
But the commission had minimal funding anyway. The government had spent $100 million investigating Clinton and Lewinsky.
Yeah.
$65 million.
I've heard different numbers.
Yeah.
But
they spent $15 million for this.
This was and this was far less money and far more significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, investigative reporters have known for a long time that if you want to find out what's going on, you follow the money. And the same thing is true in a court of law. If a prosecutor is going after somebody, what they're going to do is they're going to go after the money, because that's going to tell how it's financed and everything. I mean, it really lays out the plan. You have to do that.
Yeah. I'm just checking some notes here. I misspoke one other thing. The New Pearl Harbor thing came from an essay that Zelikow had co-authored in 1998. Apparently not the Project for a New American Century. That was a different thing.
Okay.
But many of the people in the Bush administration had a connection with that.
Absolutely.
But Zelikow's quotation about the New Pearl Harbor came out of an essay he had co-authored in 1998.
Yeah.
Let's see. We are running tight as we thought we might because there's so much information to squeeze in.
Good.
One of the things that was just coming out at the time when we did the previous program in 2008 was about the NIST report. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a federal agency. It's part of the U.S. Commerce Department, so it's under a Bush appointee.
You're right.
So it's not an independent.
Sure.
You know, people talk about it as if, oh, here's this independent thing, and it was not. It was under Bush's chain of command. And they published reports. And what can you tell us something kind of briefly about the NIST?
2,000 pages.
Yeah, sure. One point that I keep remembering, and I don't want to forget to bring up, is that the NIST report on the towers spent, 9,999 pages on before the collapses of the towers started. They analyzed, intensely all the, the fires and the planes impacting and the design of the planes, and but really the NIST report stops there. They have maybe 5 paragraphs on the actual collapses of the towers. So they don't really look at all this information that we're looking at here is evidence that we notice after the collapses start and the collapses in it. And so that's an important point.
Yeah,
we're not saying that our information against NIST information. NIST has a theory that they're talking about, the column failure theory, but we're looking at things that NIST didn't really even look at.
And you're right about the page number thing. It was about 10,000 pages.
Yeah.
And it ends with when the towers were, quote, poised to collapse, unquote. So all this stuff that we've been talking about, they did not even look at. They spent 10,000 pages, did not even look at how the collapse happened.
Global collapse ensued.
Yeah.
And then there you go.
That was it. It just happened.
Yeah.
And a point that we want to make too is that what happened to this 98% of the metal from that building, then it got shipped overseas and it was melted down.
Right.
Now, when you're doing a criminal investigation, one of the things that you do is you check to see what happened to the evidence. And anybody who tampers with evidence, that is a big no-no, okay?
Right.
You can't do that because that's essentially implicating you. If you are involved in the cover-up of evidence, then you are participating in the crime.
Yeah, and the people were startled at how rapidly the stuff was removed and sent away to other countries to be melted down. And if this is the crime of the century, you'd think that they'd want to preserve the evidence and study it and stuff.
Sure.
There are a lot of ways in which the Bush and Cheney administration made themselves look bad by stonewalling, deceiving, not letting administration people testify. When Bush and Cheney were finally forced to talk to the commission, it wasn't as testimony; they were talking, and they insisted that Cheney be with Bush.
Yeah, they weren't under oath, I guess.
And not under oath; they were just talking.
Yeah,
you couldn't record it,
and there's no public record of it.
Yeah, no notes. Yeah,
and I mean, it's like this is an investigation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and there's just case after case after case of those kinds of refusals to submit documents, and some of that stuff was in the news a little bit when it was happening, and you go, how can they get away with that?
Yeah, there were a number of contradictions too for people who would want to investigate this. They'll see a number of contradictions. One that is a glaring example is what happened when Bush was asked about the 9/11 event and what he knew and so on, and he had indicated that he saw the first plane strike the North Tower before he went into the classroom. Well, that's impossible because it wasn't on TV until the next day. So if he had seen it on TV, there's two possibilities that come to my mind. One is that he saw it as part of an exercise and that he was aware of this ahead of time, or number two, that he did not get his story right and forgot to tell the story the way that he was told to tell it.
Well, and then there have been whistleblowers who've been trying to say what they know, and they don't get covered well by the press, and they get squashed by the federal government. Sibel Edmonds is a woman who was a translator, and she had substantive information. Can one of you tell us about her, kind of briefly, because we're
just tell you
tight on time?
I mean, she came into the picture afterwards. She reviewed documents, and it was clear to her that people were omitting reporting on certain information, or they would say this document is not important, and in fact it was. So yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that's going on.
She worked for the FBI.
Yeah,
exactly. Right.
Yeah, and well, she had seen in the notes I have here that months before 9/11, she had seen FBI documents warning that Al Qaeda was preparing to hit New York with airplanes.
Yeah.
And her information was always squelched.
Oh yeah. I think she was not allowed to testify on that.
Yeah, there's a gag order, and I think it's still on.
Yeah.
She can't.
Yeah, she's not allowed to speak about that even. There are some other odd, fishy things. It happened on that day of September 11 that there were military war game exercises. So the planes that normally would have been flown up to deal with this were not available.
Exactly.
That there had been, people are saying, oh, is this bolt out of the blue? Nobody could have predicted it. And there actually had been scenarios played out with precisely this kind of thing happening. So not a bolt out of the blue. They had already anticipated this and played these war games around that.
Intelligence officers have been told about a plan like that in the Philippines. I think it was back in like 1995.
Yeah, and they had pretty specific information from intelligence agencies in Italy and Germany and Britain and Russia and Israel and a bunch of places.
And on that day, one of the, I think there was somewhere between, between 7 and 9 war games going on that day. I mean, they really had a lot going on. It was kind of like on 7/07, 2007, when in London with the bombing that was occurring, they had exercises going on at that time too to confuse things. Right. So it's not the first time that something like that happened.
And so it happened again in that British case, where they had a war game going on about the very thing that was happening for real on that same day.
It works as a cover-up.
And we did that in this country on September 11, 2001.
Yeah, one of the...
What are the odds of that?
No,
for it to happen once is unbelievable. To happen twice is just beyond.
And one of the war games too was about a passenger aircraft flying into was the headquarters of a government building. So, it was known. It was
that this thing was possible.
Yeah, they were doing war games about it.
But U.S. officials, Condoleezza Rice and Bush, they're up there after 9/11 saying that we could never have imagined anything like this happening.
Yeah. We're down to about our last 10 minutes, and there are a couple of other fishy things we need to squeeze in. Well, let's move on to this thing that you've been doing some reading about, this system justification. Excuse me, before we do that, we want to do the terror management theory.
Okay,
and tell us about this terror management theory, because that's also new since the previous program, and I want to make sure we cover that.
Right. Well, this is kind of in the the related sociology area. There was a paper I read by Lori Manuel called In Denial of Democracy, and it ran in the American Behavioral Scientist this year. And she discusses a couple of models, this terror management theory or system justification theory as well, I'll talk about just briefly, but they're just models that describe psychological mechanisms that come into play individually and collectively when dealing with information like what we're discussing here today. Terror management theory, one way you can think of it is it relates to like the politics of fear. Think about the Bush administration, how often they would invoke 9/11, constantly invoking remember 9/11, and this is, so we've got in our heads now thoughts of terror and death, constantly reinforced. The Obama administration does a similar thing,
Right.
but it was really extreme. And so, studies have shown now that when you have this going on, it will lead people to support restrictions on their civil liberties, charismatic leaders, wars. So that's a little bit of the model, terror management theory, and how it can create this effect in our society. System justification theory, when people are presented with alternative information like the stuff we're discussing here tonight, it can evoke strong cognitive dissonance in people if they're not familiar with this information. So they just tend to curtail their evaluation of that evidence. They don't necessarily, for banal and psychological defense type of reasons. Everybody's very busy. No, who has time to devote a serious amount of time to looking into these things? But also, as a way to what will naturally happen is you'll justify the system that protects, the existing economic and political situation that we live in, protects us from the evildoers. So that's a simplistic way of talking about this, but
because the system that rules is a bit more comfortable than questioning it and venturing out into the unknown. Just easier
Absolutely.
to sort of retreat.
Absolutely, it's much easier to have a definitive answer to a question than to sit around with ambiguity and confusion on especially huge issues like this.
And then we see this in as we're taping this program in 2010. There's been news during the summer about these WikiLeaks, the release of information about what's really going on in the wars that we're doing. And there's outrage that anybody is daring to upset the apple cart, and the mainstream media even are coming down very heavy on the WikiLeaks people for releasing this information, when the news media ought to be saying, oh, here's information we need to be putting out. But instead they're kind of like circle the wagons and don't let any challenging information come out. And this is in the summer of 2010.
Yeah.
When we should have learned from Watergate and from the Vietnam experience and everything else that people need to get this information. And people do distrust the government. And that's across the political spectrum. It's the left and the right and the middle. Everybody has skepticism. And it seems like, to my way of thinking, it's better to find out what's really going on than to pretend like we somehow should not know the truth.
Yeah, that's where we find ourselves today, is in a situation where it's very easy to become frightened by these facts and to have a high level of uncertainty. And given we're feeling fear and uncertainty, we look for people that have the answers and that are strong in their determination and expression, so that we can follow them.
Yeah.
But if we don't examine what they're saying carefully, we may be misled, and that's the danger that I want people to avoid.
Right. When one of the evidences of this is when people who do question, as we're trying to do on the show, and say, look, the official story doesn't add up.
Yeah.
There's other information that's not being considered. Then we would be accused of being conspiracy nuts. And that's one way of stifling debate, just like it used to be that you could shut down debate by calling somebody a communist.
Right.
And that would just put an end to the conversation.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this. There's the official story, the official myth that's out there, and the official story is a conspiracy. It's a matter of where the conspiracy goes.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you want to define the term conspiracy, but we're talking about the pejorative use of the term.
Right.
That's a huge issue.
But it really. I know that your values and my values are all having to do with intellectual honesty. Let's find out what's really going on, and we need to do that. We're very tight on time. I want to just mention some good sources of information that I know you folks and I have relied on. The Architects and Engineers group is at www.ae911truth.org. There are people who've researched the Building 7 at www.911research.gov. wtc7.net.
Right. Jim Hoffmann's site.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I know you've gotten a lot of information from him and that
Yeah.
site. There's the Journal of 9/11studies.org, and there's stj911.org. And then a lot of books by David Ray Griffin has written a lot.
Right.
Paul Thompson was the guy who
Yeah.
had early on developed a timeline. He just went to all the
Yeah.
different sources, usually public sources.
Yeah,
and
all
just
mainstream sources, yeah.
pulled out things to produce probably the most credible timeline by pulling from all these sources and stuff. So that was Paul Thompson and Stephen E. Jones. You've gotten a lot of information
Yeah.
from him. There's just a lot going around, and
Absolutely.
there are some sources that are off in the wacky areas that I would not
Right.
give credibility to, but there
Yeah.
are plenty of respectable mainstream ones that have reliable information, and the scientists that do the peer-reviewed things where they check each other's work and say, yeah, this is all
Yeah.
on the up and up, it's honest and accurate.
Yeah. One quick note while you're talking about the sites is when we were talking about the dust and the analysis of the dust, that paper, Active Thermitic Materials Discovered in the Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe, it's a very academic or scholarly paper, but Jim Hoffmann's site, the 9/11research.wtc7.net, he's written a couple of very summary papers that really help explain that whole issue. There's only so much time we have, and we just touched on it, but those are great.
Yeah. So I want to thank both Terry Machinata and Drew Gibbs. It's scary and hard to explore tough questions like these, but we really have to look at that. And if you contact the information sources we mentioned in the program, you will learn a lot. Check them out. Make up your own mind. Let the chips fall where they may. Look at things that rebut each other and sort all this out. You can also get source material by visiting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website, which is www.olympiafor.org. And we also have information about a variety of other topics. We are all one human family, and we all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs your help. Thanks. Or Pennsylvania, but we'll focus especially on the World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7, and on the government's investigation and reports. We'll also focus on the need to be open-minded and mature in how we address the programs. Researchers have brought forth new information since our 2008 program, especially regarding evidence of explosives in those buildings, and so we'll address that during the hour. And we'll discuss why it's so hard for people to grapple with these kinds of hard questions. None of us are true believers in any kind of a conspiracy theory, not the one that's promoted by the government and not the one that some people have put out that are less well grounded in facts. But we do believe in examining all the information. with open mind and letting the chips fall where they may. And we encourage you, the viewers, to do your own research. There are plenty of sources of information, and we'll list those by the end of the program. Terry, I know this has been a special concern of yours. Can you share your sense of that, the open-mindedness and the difficulty of grappling with these kinds of hard issues?
Yes, Glenn, one of the things that became obvious to me as I was investigating this is how important it is for us to be able to move from that place of being, trying to vilify people who disagree with us, to being at a place where we realize that, as you indicated, that people with good minds and really a positive intention are really attempting to find out what the facts are. And we're faced with a lot of issues at this time with our economy and wars and everything else. And it can make a person feel a little bit helpless, or maybe a lot helpless and even overwhelmed. And during this program, I'm hopeful that in our discussion, we'll be able to move from that place of really wondering if it's even worth investigating to, yes, it is worth investigating, and it's our patriotic duty to do so. And as we do that, we will gain a spirit of cooperation and understanding and tolerance for each other that this country desperately needs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know you share the same sense. We've talked about this a number of times in the last few months when we were deciding we should do another program on the topic.
That's right. It's still important to look at this stuff even 9 years later because 9/11 is used as kind of the emotional underpinning that supports this continual wars of aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan and the ongoing war on terror. And so we need to look at 9/11 continually.
And part of that sense of open-mindedness and let the chips fall where they may, includes admitting when we made a mistake. And I made a mistake on the previous program we did, so I want to correct that information right at the outset. There was a passport from one of the hijackers that crashed into the buildings that was recovered afterward. And on the program, my recollection was that I had heard a news report saying that it was directly below the building, and then a close friend whom I respect said, "Oh, actually, that was some blocks away." So I just want to correct that I had misstated where that passport was found. I'm still troubled by the idea that if this guy was a passenger in a plane and the passport is something you carry on your person in a pocket, because you have to have that when you go through customs when you land before you get your luggage, so it would have been on his person. If he was in the airplane that crashed in the building and blew up and burned, how did it end up
Seems unlikely.
In good condition?
Right.
So that problem still exists, but it was
point.
found blocks away, not directly underneath. So I apologize for that misstatement. Now, World Trade Center's Building 1 and 2 were struck by two different airplanes. Each tower burned for just a relatively brief time before it collapsed at a speed that was close to a free fall gravity rate of speed. And the official story blames columns, the big heavy steel columns, with burning and collapsing and causing this. What does the evidence say about this? Either of you?
Well, I'll start with saying that my understanding is the official story indicated that they weakened, but they did not melt. And there's a disagreement about there being molten steel in the structure. But I'll save some of that for a little bit later. But go ahead, Drew.
Well, one thing to mention is that there's two things to mention that are coming to mind at the moment. But they quickly scrubbed the site of like 98.9 or 99 point. Almost all of the debris and steel was trucked off immediately. From the samples that they did, or what they did save some samples of steel from the apparently that were supposedly around the impact zones where the planes impacted the buildings. And I think something like less than 2% of those samples that they saved, they did perform tests on those, and they saw less than 2% saw temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius. So to me and to scientists, that indicates that the temperatures were nowhere near hot enough to you know, have this kind of stated reason for the column failure theory of the collapse.
Right. And the smoke that we saw did not look like, you know, the flames that we saw and the smoke did not indicate a hot fire either, because a really hot fire is like blue or, you know, but this looked like just a regular kind of fire, and then the black smoke is a fire, indicates a fire that's not getting much oxygen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's not a hot fire.
There's also, I think that you mentioned this last time, Drew, is that when NIST came out with its final report,
And that's
it actually,
the federal agency that did a study of this. We'll talk about them later. But,
that they, apparently there was a disagreement among the people who were actually there during the experiment, and that they found that there was not sufficient heat to be able to create that problem. And in the official story, they'd indicated there was a 42-inch slumping of the structure, but in fact there was only a few.
Hi, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Our September 2008 TV program examined some of the flaws in the government's official story about what had happened 7 years before on September 11, 2001. A growing number of people, including many scientists, architects, engineers, pilots, and other professionals, have continued to analyze new information. So now we are presenting some of that new information on this new program, along with some of the persistent critiques of the government's official story. On the very next day after the September 11 attacks, Dick Cheney said that we should respond by attacking Iraq. The next month, Bush launched a war against Afghanistan, and Congress passed the Patriot Act without even reading it. Everything was happening at once, and people were feeling just overwhelmed by the rush of events. But some people started to challenge the official story and ask questions that the mainstream media were not asking and that the government really was not wanting to answer. People were asking thoughtful questions, but they were not getting credible answers. The official culture wants to dismiss these kinds of questions as conspiracy theorists, but the vast majority of the skeptics are thoughtful, intelligent, meticulous, and well-respected citizens, and they keep finding that the government story has holes in it. They find evidence that rebuts the government's official story, and they've discovered what seem to be deliberate efforts to prevent the alternative information from coming out. We believe that it is okay to ask hard questions. We believe it's okay to question the official story, to hold up actual evidence, compare it with the official story, and to stay open-minded and follow the truth wherever it goes. So this program will follow up on the program from 2 years before. We have two guests who were present on the previous program, Terry Machinata and Drew Gibbs. These are local folks who have spent hundreds of hours researching the topic. They approach the topic with open minds and with practical attitudes, and I'm happy to welcome Terry and Drew. Thanks. I'm glad you're back to explore the topic further.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
We'll have a good time and pack a lot of information in like we did on the previous program. Our previous program had addressed a great many aspects of the 9/11 situation, and this current program will not deal with the airplanes that hit the Pentagon